mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas. Ayang magiliw, sa sinamanan, alam ng puso, sa ito'y buhay. Lupang binirang, wala ng pag-ibig, sa magtutubig, kita pasisingin, sa nagtatapulong sa simula, sa langit o bagaw, ay tinatang nila ang isang pagkayang inamahal. Sa kapag-awal ko'y ay nanatiligin, ang ituwid na parang kailan, ang kanyang matitigin. Mga araw ka, maraming pagsika, buhay natin sa piling mo. Ang bigaya na ay marami, ang malagay ng dahil sa'yo. Simula noon hanggang ngayon, isa ang naging layon. Magkaisa ang mga mundo, kaibigan ay marunong. Tayo mula sa hamon ng lakas, niyang sa panalig na umanlang. Pinagako sa puso at paniniwala, ang ihawang para sa kamatayan. Pagsan mo ay nagumpay, bumalang pawis suot buhay. Kapayapaan, katagunan, ay ating ang nakamtan. Alam Bolivia, alam Bolivia, pagpalay mo sa mundo. Ang sakong magsamoro, lagi kang mamahalin. Walang pipigil sa damdamin, mga pagkato'y tutuparin. Habang buhay kami sa'yo'y magbabantay, mananatili sa puso't isipan. Ang nakatubig ay nanabuwis ng buhay, nasa pilang may kapal. Ang sanggol ay nagumpay, bumalang pawis suot buhay. Kapayapaan, katagunan, ay ating ang nakamtan. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, pagpalay mo sa mundo.
Legislation bilang dali-dali malaki sumisubang kasalukuyan at napakamahan. Nagalikan, nagatingnan at komentaryo at balita ang programa ito'y patas sa lahat. Walang pinikilingan, walang pinatamihan at walang pinatamihan ang programa ito. Ang programa ito ay public service sa kahanginan at trabaho lamang.
Female voice, male voice, lolly voice, monster voice.
Okay, tingnan natin ang time check natin. Okay, 20 minutos, pasado na po alas 10 na. Okay, sigurado na po nakadasal na po ng Tarawih, Salatut Tarawih, at saka may ibang gawain po pag ganitong gabi mga suki, no? Gabi ng pag-ayuno. Okay, ang gabi ngayon, gabi po ng Martes, okay, 14 ng Marso 2024. Okay, ang programa po natin ay pinilit mag-program kahit hirap na hirap tayo po sa pag-ayuno mga suki, no? Ayan. So, magandang gabi sa inyo. Good evening, good evening, good evening. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Nandito tayo sa Consolidated News natin, no? Okay, sa gabing ito, sa programa pa rin ng halo-halo special opinion, balita at iba pa. Kasama po serbisyo publiko, tinig ng mamamayan. And then, ugnayan po ng mamamayan, no? Okay, shout out sa lahat. Okay, mga suki-suki natin. Hindi bumitaw po sa programa natin, mga tagapakinig, no? Okay, so umpisahan natin ang balita. Ang presidente po natin, si President Ferdinand Romualdez Marcos Jr., okay, sa kasalukuyan po sa Czech Republic, okay, to meet ang kanyang counterpart, Petr Pavel. Naalala natin si Václav Havel, no? Václav Havel. Ito naman ay si Petr Pavel. Okay, so pinag-usapan ng ugnayan, diniscuss po, okay, paano magkaroon po ng strengthen ng bilateral cooperation and multilateral partnership between the government of the Philippines and the Czech Republic, mga kababayan, no? Okay, nandito ang picture nila. PH Czech Republic explore ways to strengthen bilateral cooperation, multilateral partnership, mga suki, no? Okay, so okay, nasa Europe. Okay, itong leader natin po galing sa Berlin, Germany, and then pupunta naman po sa as scheduled. Pupunta naman po doon sa bansang Czech Republic, mga suki, na. So yan po ang unang information maibigay ko sa inyo po sa gabing ito, mga kababayan, na. Okay. So kukuha tayo ng mga nakaraan po, mga suki, no? Ang 2009 Nobel Peace Prize, okay, tinanggap po ng Pangulo, okay, itong si President Barack Obama, no? Okay, maikli lang, mga 37 minutos at saka 4 na segundo, mga kabayan. Yung pagtanggap niya, no? Okay, sandali lang. Awesome!
Female voice, male voice, lolly voice, monster voice,
Okay, skip muna tayo sa Pilipinas. Maraming marites po rito sa Pilipinas, mga suki, no? Especialmente itong kaso po ni ni Pastor Apollo Kibuloy ng Davao City. Hindi pa po ni lubayan po ng mga senadora ng bayan diyan po sa Senate, mga kababayan. Lalo na po ito si Panay Banat po, itong si Senadora Risa Hontiveros, no? Okay, kaya pa kaya ni Pastor ito ang mga pasabog sa kanyang buhay, mga suki, mga kababayan, no? Okay. Kaya pa kaya? Okay. Wala na siyang SMNI, paano na kung siya makabawi po, mga suki, no? Paano siya maka-reply? Okay, makasagot. Okay, sa kanyang programa po, mga suki, mga kababayan, no? Okay. So, talagang pulos banat, ang itong si Risa Hontiveros sa mga kakampi niya, mga suki, no? Okay. Sana mag-election na po sa 2025, mga suki, no? Okay. Yung mga kakampi po ni Tatay Digong sa 2025, at least ay handang-handa na po, mga suki, sa sabak, sa 2025, no? Or, para makaganti sila. Okay, talagang bugbog sirado po ang kampo po ni Tatay Digong, mga suki, no? Lalo na po ang dalawa sila talaga ni Pastor Kibuloy, ang bugbog sarado po sa kasalukuyan, mga suki, mga kababayan, no? Okay, paano kaya makabawi sila yan? Okay, palagay ko makabawi pa rin, no? Okay, hindi pa rin mag-mintis ang kanilang popularity. Okay, itong kampo po ng PDP Laban, no? Okay, so ilang buwan na lang. Titiisin po ni Pastor Kibuloy mga 13 months, more or less mga 13 months, no? Okay, titiisin niya ang araw-araw po banat sa kanya, mga suki, no? Sila ni Tatay Digong. Okay. So, kailangan sila maraming bala po pang depensa. Okay, itong dalawa itong mga suki, no? Kampo po ni Tatay Digong at saka itong si Pastor Kibuloy, mga suki, no? Para man lang at least makasagot, masagot nila po yung mga issue, pinupukol sa kanila, mga kabayan, sa kanila daw, no? Okay. At least makadepensa lang. Importante po makadepensa, no? Okay, dapat ang kanilang social media, yung mga news online nila hindi po padihado, mga suki, mga kababayan, no? Okay. Dapat maka-reply sila. Right to reply po pag akusado ka, mga kababayan, no? Okay, huwag itong mga kakampi nila, huwag po pahimi-himi, para hindi po bugbog sirado po itong kampo ng dalawa na ito, na. Okay. So, yan. Okay. So, ganun talaga. Okay, basta marites, marami sa atin. Talagang ganun talaga, masuki, na. Okay. Okay, maraming marites sa Pilipinas. Napapanggan natin si former President Nobel Peace Prize lecture by President Obama, no? Mga 37 minutes at saka 4 na segundo lang. Okay.
And now, Mr. President, the floor is yours to give your Nobel lecture.
Majesties, Your Royal Highness.
Okay, gusto ko lang ito makinig. Yung power ng statement po ng isang leader, no? Okay, yung mga pagbigkas ng salita. Okay, pagbigkas ng salita po pinaparating sa tao, no? Sa mga audience. Yun ang gusto ko po rito sa former president po ng Professor of Law. Okay, graduate ng Harvard. At saka yung asawa na sa Ivy League. Okay, Ivy League. Ayan, magaling po mag-asawa ito mga suki, no? Okay, ito ay abogado, cum laude po sa Harvard University, and then yung isa rin, isang abogado rin mga suki, no? Mag-asawa po, abogasya sila. Okay, yung gusto ko sinubaybayan, yung power ng statement po ng isang leader, no? Pagbigkas ng salita, pag-convince po ng audience. Yun ang gusto ko sa kanya po mga suki, no? Tapos yung communication, ang kanyang arrangement ng pag-speech, okay, kompleto po mga suki. No? Wala kang masabi po okay, sa mga grammar, okay, wala kang masabi mga suki. No? Talagang, okay, na-master po ito ng abogado ito mga suki. No? Okay, si former President Barack Obama. Yun ang ay tinitingnan ko lagi po yung pag magbigkas ng salita, mag-speech. Okay, ang kanyang arrangement ng pananalita mga suki, mga kababayan, no? Napagaling. Napagaling po mga suki. Ayan.
Distinguished members of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, citizens of America, and citizens of the world. I receive this honor with deep gratitude and great humility. It's an award that speaks to our highest aspirations. And for all the cruelty and hardship of our world, we are not mere prisoners of fate. Our actions matter and can bend history in the direction of justice. And yet I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the considerable controversy that your generous decision has generated. In part, this is because I am at the beginning and not the end of my labors on the world stage. Compared to some of the giants of history who have received this prize, Schweitzer and King, Marshall, and Mandela, my accomplishments are slight. And then there are the men and women around the world who've been jailed and beaten in the pursuit of justice. Those who toil in humanitarian organizations to relieve suffering. The unrecognized millions whose quiet acts of courage and compassion inspire even the most hardened cynics. I cannot argue with those who find these men and women, some known, some obscure to all but those they help, to be far more deserving of this honor than I. But perhaps the most profound issue surrounding my receipt of this prize is the fact that I am the commander-in-chief of the military of a nation in the midst of two wars. One of these wars is winding down. The other is a conflict that America did not seek, one in which we are joined by 42 other countries, including Norway, in an effort to defend ourselves and all nations from further attacks. Still, we are at war. And I'm responsible for the deployment of thousands of young Americans to battle in a distant land. And some will kill, and some will be killed. And so I come here with an acute sense of the costs of armed conflict, filled with difficult questions about the relationship between war and peace, and our effort to replace one with the other. Now, these questions are not new. War in one form or another appeared with the first man. At the dawn of history, its morality was not questioned. It was simply a fact, like drought or disease. The manner in which tribes and then civilizations sought power and settled their differences. And over time, as codes of law sought to control violence within groups, so did philosophers and clerics and statesmen seek to regulate the destructive power of war. The concept of a just war emerged, suggesting that war is justified only when certain conditions were met. If it is waged as a last resort or in self-defense, if the force used is proportional, and if, whenever possible, civilians are spared from violence. Of course, we know that for most of history, this concept of just war was rarely observed. The capacity of human beings to think up new ways to kill one another proved inexhaustible, as did our capacity to exempt from mercy those who look different or pray to a different God. Wars between armies gave way to wars between nations, total wars, in which the distinction between combatant and civilian became blurred. In the span of 30 years, such carnage would twice engulf this continent. And while it's hard to conceive of a cause more just than the defeat of the Third Reich and the Axis powers, World War II was a conflict in which the total number of civilians who died exceeded the number of soldiers who perished. In the wake of such destruction, and with the advent of the nuclear age, it became clear to victor and vanquished alike that the world needed institutions to prevent another world war. And so, a quarter century after, the United States Senate rejected the League of Nations, an idea for which Woodrow Wilson received this prize. America led the world in constructing an architecture to keep the peace, a Marshall Plan and a United Nations, mechanisms to govern the waging of war, treaties to protect human rights, prevent genocide, restrict the most dangerous weapons. In many ways, these efforts succeeded. Yes, terrible wars have been fought and atrocities committed, but there has been no Third World War. The Cold War ended with jubilant crowds dismantling a wall. Commerce has stitched much of the world together. Billions have been lifted from poverty. The ideals of liberty and self-determination, equality, and the rule of law have haltingly advanced. We are the heirs of the fortitude and foresight of generations past. And it is a legacy for which my own country is rightfully proud. And yet, a decade into a new century, this old architecture is buckling under the weight of new threats. The world may no longer shudder at the prospect of war between two nuclear superpowers, but proliferation may increase the risk of catastrophe. Terrorism has long been a tactic, but modern technology allows a few small men with outsized rage to murder innocents on a horrific scale. Moreover, wars between nations have increasingly given way to wars within nations. The resurgence of ethnic or sectarian conflicts, the growth of secessionist movements, insurgencies, and failed states. All these things have increasingly trapped civilians in unending chaos. In today's wars, many more civilians are killed than soldiers. The seeds of future conflict are sown. Economies are wrecked, civil societies torn asunder, refugees amassed, children scarred. I do not bring with me today a definitive solution to the problems of war. What I do know is that meeting these challenges will require the same vision, hard work, and persistence of those men and women who acted so boldly decades ago. And it will require us to think in new ways about the notions of just war and the imperatives of a just peace. We must begin by acknowledging a hard truth. We will not eradicate violent conflict in our lifetimes. There will be times when nations, acting individually or in concert, will find the use of force not only necessary, but morally justified. I make this statement mindful of what Martin Luther King Jr. said in this same ceremony years ago. Violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more.
Okay, violence means never, ano yun, never give a solution, mga kababayan, no? Okay, pakinggan natin uli yun. Violence means never serve a solution. Okay, that's sandali lang.
An idol in the face of threats to the American people. For make no mistake, evil does exist in the world. Al-Qaeda's leaders to lay down their arms. Negotiations cannot convince Al-Qaeda's leaders to lay down their arms.
Violence means, ulitin natin, no? Gusto ko ang term ginamit niya. Ayan.
To the moral force of nonviolence. I know there's nothing weak, nothing passive, nothing naive in the creed and lives of Gandhi and King. But as a head of state sworn to protect and defend my nation, I cannot be guided by their examples alone. I face the world as it is and cannot stand idle in the face of threats to the American people. For make no mistake, evil does exist in the world. A nonviolent movement could not have halted Hitler's armies. Negotiations cannot convince Al-Qaeda's leaders to lay down their arms. To say that force may sometimes be necessary is not a call to cynicism, it is a recognition of history, the imperfections of man, and the limits of reason. I raise this point. I begin with this point because in many countries, there is a deep ambivalence about military action today, no matter what the cost. And at times, this is joined by a reflexive suspicion of America, the world's sole military superpower. Yet the world must remember that it was not simply international institutions, not just treaties and declarations, that brought stability to a post-World War II world. Whatever mistakes we have made, the plain fact is this: the United States of America has helped underwrite global security for more than 6 decades with the blood of our citizens and the strength of our arms. The service and sacrifice of our men and women in uniform has promoted peace and prosperity from Germany to Korea and enabled democracy to take hold in places like the Balkans. We have borne this burden not because we seek to impose our will. We have done so out of enlightened self-interest, because we seek a better future for our children and grandchildren, and we believe that their lives will be better if others' children and grandchildren can live in freedom and prosperity. So yes, the instruments of war do have a role to play in preserving the peace. And yet this truth must coexist with another: that no matter how justified, war promises human tragedy. The soldier's courage and sacrifice is full of glory, expressing devotion to country, to cause, to comrades in arms. But war itself is never glorious. And we must never trumpet it as such. So part of our challenge is reconciling these two seemingly irreconcilable truths. That war is sometimes necessary. And war, at some level, is an expression of human folly. Concretely, we must direct our effort to the task that President Kennedy called for long ago. Let us focus, he said, on a more practical, more attainable peace, based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions. A gradual evolution of human institutions. What might this evolution look like? What might these practical steps be? To begin with, I believe that all nations, strong and weak alike, must adhere to standards that govern the use of force. I, like any head of state, reserve the right to act unilaterally, if necessary, to defend my nation. Nevertheless, I am convinced that adhering to standards, international standards, strengthens those who do, and isolates and weakens those who don't. The world rallied around America after the 9/11 attacks and continues to support our efforts in Afghanistan because of the horror of those senseless attacks and the recognized principle of self-defense. Likewise, the world recognized the need to confront Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait, a consensus that sent a clear message to all about the cost of aggression. Furthermore, America, in fact, no nation, can insist that others follow the rules of the road if we refuse to follow them ourselves. For when we don't, our actions appear arbitrary and undercut the legitimacy of future interventions, no matter how justified. And this becomes particularly important when the purpose of military action extends beyond self-defense or defense of one nation against an aggressor. More and more, we all confront difficult questions about how to prevent the slaughter of civilians by their own government, or to stop a civil war whose violence and suffering can engulf an entire region. I believe that force can be justified on humanitarian grounds, as it was in the Balkans, or in other places that have been scarred by war. Inaction tears at our conscience and can lead to more costly intervention later. And that's why
Okay. Ang kanyang justification, no? Halimbawa, Estado. Okay. May karapatan po puminsala. Okay. Sa salitang yakan bang ahin na kita kole-kole. Kaya nita kole-kole. Okay, ganito stop. So, ang Estado may karapatan po ay puminsala sa kanyang halimbawa, citizen. Okay, unruly na. Yan po ang ibig sabihin na unruly. Okay, manira na sa kapwa. Okay, hindi na mapigilan. Ang Estado po may karapatan puminsala. Okay, sa kanyang power. Okay, yan po ang ibig sabihin po. Okay, ng former president no sa kanyang lecture. Okay. So ina-apply yan, no? Okay, sa kahit mga local government units. Okay, ang tao po ng society na hindi ay okay, ibig sabihin nakasira na sa sa community, nakasira na sa kauman. Okay, may karapatan pang Estado. Okay? Pinsalain niya yung tao na hindi po mapigilan gumawa ng kasamaan, no? Ayan, yun ang kanyang ibig sabihin po sa kanyang lecture, no? Okay, sige, continue lang natin. Okay. Mag-lecture din tayo para okay, makashare din ng programa natin, no? Ayan. Sige.
Responsible nations must embrace the role that militaries with a clear mandate can play to keep the peace. America's commitment to global security will never waver, but in a world in which threats are more diffuse and missions more complex, America cannot act alone. America alone cannot secure the peace. This is true in Afghanistan. This is true in failed states like Somalia, where terrorism and piracy is joined by famine and human suffering. And sadly, it will continue to be true in unstable regions for years to come. The leaders and soldiers of NATO countries and other friends and allies demonstrate this truth through the capacity and courage they've shown in Afghanistan. But in many countries, there is a disconnect between the efforts of those who serve and the ambivalence of the broader public. I understand why war is not popular, but I also know this: the belief that peace is desirable is rarely enough to achieve it. Peace requires responsibility. Peace.
Okay, between violence motive and peace, ang ibig sabihin mga kababayan. Yung mga peace, okay, yung violence cycle, okay, nangyayari po sa mga lipunan natin, dapat talaga sugpuin. Ang ibig sabihin, no? Between violence and peace. So saan pang mananaig? Dapat ang kapayapaan po mananaig. Kaya nga, ang nangyayari sa lipunan minsan nagkaroon no? Yung violence cycle dapat sugpuin, okay, ng Estado, okay, para ma-achieve ang peace, mga kababayan, no? Okay. So, yan po ang ibig sabihin niya, mga kababayan, no? Yung katulad ng journey ni Jim Hataman. Okay, journey ni Jim Hataman malalim yun, mga suki, no? Okay. Alam natin po ang kasaysayan ng Basilan, no? Kaya sinabi ko, okay, nangyayari na mga pugutan ng ulo, okay, mga ganun ba? Hindi na po makakontrol ng Estado. Okay, kung hindi ay sugpuin at saka durugin po yung mga ganun style, mga suki, no? I-relate natin itong subject matter between peace and violence, mga suki, no? Okay, tinatawag na violence cycle. Cycle of violence. Tama ba yun? Violence cycle o cycle of violence. Kung wala nang katapusan ng violence, dapat talagang sugpuin po ng Estado pag ganun po ang situation, no? Kaya mahirap talaga. Okay, Estado at saka lipunan. Ayan. So, dapat makontrol ang lipunan ng Estado. Kaya nga, yung journey, okay, nangyari po sa Basilan, okay, mahalaga po kasaysayan ng Basilan yun, no? Okay, mahalaga yon. Okay, sa kasaysayan natin, no? Wala nang, kung hindi ganun walang katapusan po ang kaguluhan, mga suki, no? So, ngayon, wala na. So, yon po ang ibig sabihin po, lecture ito, okay, between peace and violence, mga suki, no? Violence motives. Okay, ipagpatuloy natin.
Entails sacrifice. That's why NATO continues to be indispensable. That's why we must strengthen UN and regional peacekeeping and not leave the task to a few countries. That's why we honor those who return home from peacekeeping and training abroad, to Oslo and Rome, to Ottawa and Sydney, to Dhaka and Kigali. We honor them not as makers of war, but as wagers of peace. Let me make one final.
Okay, mabigat pa weight ng peace, no? Mabigat ng sa Estado, mabigat po ng weight of peace. okay, against violence, mga suki, no? So, ibig sabihin, mabigat po ang weight ng peace, isulong po ang kapayapaan, okay, supuin po ng karahasan, mga suki, no? So, okay, matagal na ako din mag-aral dito. Okay, naintindihan ko lahat yun, mga suki, mga kababayan, no? Okay, go ahead. Ayan.
Point about the use of force. Even as we make difficult decisions about going to war, we must also think clearly about how we fight it. The Nobel Committee recognized this truth in awarding its first prize for peace to Henry Dunant, the founder of the Red Cross and a driving force behind the Geneva Conventions. Where force is necessary, we have a moral and strategic interest in binding ourselves to certain rules of conduct. And even as we confront a vicious adversary that abides by no rules, I believe the United States of America must remain a standard bearer in the conduct of war.
Okay, dapat manalo po ang kapayapaan, no? Ang peace motive, okay, dapat manalo po sa lipunan, mga suki, no? Hindi pwede po maghari ang kaguluhan. Yung mga violence motive, hindi po pwede maghari, no? Kaya nga minsan magtaka tayo sinagasaan po ng Estado, mga kababayan, no? Okay, yung mga magsulong, okay, ng magulo, mga suki, no? Okay, sinasagasaan talaga ng Estado. Okay.
That is what makes us different from those whom we fight. That is a source of our strength. That is why I prohibited torture. That is why I ordered the prison at Guantanamo Bay closed. And that is why I have reaffirmed America's commitment to abide by the Geneva Conventions. We lose ourselves when we compromise the very ideals that we fight to defend. And we honor those ideals by upholding them, not when it's easy, but when it is hard. I've spoken at some length to the question that must weigh on our minds and our hearts as we choose to wage war. But let me now turn to our effort to avoid such tragic choices and speak of 3 ways that we can build a just and lasting peace. First, in dealing with those nations that break rules and laws, I believe that we must develop alternatives to violence that are tough enough to actually change behavior. For if we want a lasting peace, then the words of the international community must mean something. Those regimes that break the rules must be held accountable. Sanctions must exact a real price. Intransigence must be met with increased pressure, and such pressure exists only when the world stands together as one. One urgent example is the effort to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and to seek a world without them. In the middle of the last century, nations agreed to be bound by a treaty whose bargain is clear. All will have access to peaceful nuclear power. Those without nuclear weapons will forsake them, and those with nuclear weapons will work towards disarmament. I am committed to upholding this treaty. It is a centerpiece of my foreign policy. And I'm working with President Medvedev to reduce America and Russia's nuclear stockpiles. But it's also incumbent upon all of us to insist that nations like Iran and North Korea do not game the system. Those who claim to respect international law cannot avert their eyes when those laws are flouted. Those who care for their own security cannot ignore the danger of an arms race in the Middle East or East Asia. Those who seek peace cannot stand idly by as nations arm themselves for nuclear war. The same principle applies to those who violate international laws by brutalizing their own people. When there is genocide in Darfur, systematic rape in Congo, repression in Burma, there must be consequences. Yes, there will be engagement. Yes, there will be diplomacy. But there must be consequences when those things fail. And the closer we stand together, the less likely we will be faced with the choice between armed intervention and complicity in oppression. This brings me to a second point: the nature of the peace that we seek. For peace is not merely the absence of visible conflict. Only a just peace, based on the inherent rights and dignity of every individual, can truly be lasting. It was this insight that drove drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War.
Just peace. Ibig sabihin mga suki, just peace. Okay. Hindi yung, okay, para bang kangaroo. Hindi parang kangaroo, pag gusunada tegokin ka na. Hindi ganun. Kailangan ng Estado, okay, magkaroon po ng ang pag-implement ng batas, just peace. Ayan. Okay. May katwiran po kahit na may kaso ka, ay may katwiran din. Pamagitan po ng due process, no? Ayan. So, kailangan po may just peace. Hindi lang kapayapaan. Just peace. Makatarungan. Okay, kapayapaan mga suki, no? Okay, go ahead.
In the wake of devastation, they recognize that if human rights are not protected, peace is a hollow promise. And yet too often, these words are ignored. For some countries, the failure to uphold human rights is excused by the false suggestion that these are somehow Western principles, foreign to local cultures or stages of a nation's development. And within America, there's long been a tension between those who describe themselves as realists or idealists. A tension that suggests a stark choice between the narrow pursuit of interests or an endless campaign to impose our values around the world. I reject these choices. I believe that peace is unstable where citizens are denied the right to speak freely or worship as they please, choose their own leaders, or assemble without fear. Pent-up grievances fester, and the suppression of tribal and religious identity can lead to violence. We also know that the opposite is true. Only when Europe became free did it finally find peace. America has never fought a war against a democracy, and our closest friends are governments that protect the rights of their citizens. No matter how callously defined, neither America's interests nor the world's are served by the denial of human aspirations. So even as we respect the unique culture and traditions of different countries, America will always be a voice for those aspirations that are universal. We will bear witness to the quiet dignity of reformers like Aung San Suu Kyi, to the bravery of Zimbabweans who cast their ballots in the face of beatings, to the hundreds of thousands who have marched silently through the streets of Iran. It is telling that the leaders of these governments fear the aspirations of their own people more than the power of any other nation. And it is the responsibility of all free people and free nations to make clear that these movements of hope and history, they have us on their side. Let me also say this: the promotion of human rights cannot be about exhortation alone. At times, it must be coupled with painstaking diplomacy. I know that engagement with repressive regimes lacks the satisfying purity of indignation. But I also know that sanctions without outreach, condemnation without discussion, can carry forward only a crippling status quo. No repressive regime can move down a new path unless it has the choice of an open door. In light of the Cultural Revolution's horrors, Nixon's meeting with Mao appeared inexcusable. And yet it surely helped set China on a path where millions of its citizens have been lifted from poverty and connected to open societies. Pope John Paul's engagement with Poland created space not just for the Catholic Church, but for labor leaders like Lech Walesa. Ronald Reagan's efforts on arms control and embrace of perestroika not only improved relations with the Soviet Union, but empowered dissidents throughout Eastern Europe. There's no simple formula here, but we must try as best we can to balance isolation and engagement, pressure and incentives, so that human rights and dignity are advanced over time. Third, a just peace includes not only civil and political rights, it must encompass economic security and opportunity. For true peace is not just freedom from fear, but freedom from want. It is undoubtedly true that development rarely takes root without security. It is also true that security does not exist where human beings do not have access to enough food or clean water or the medicine and shelter they need to survive. It does not exist where children can't aspire to a decent education or a job that supports a family. The absence of hope can rot a society from within. And that's why helping farmers feed their own people or nations educate their children and care for the sick is not mere charity. It's also why the world must come together to confront climate change. There's little scientific dispute that if we do nothing, we will face more drought, more famine, more mass displacement, all of which will fuel more conflict for decades. For this reason, it's not merely scientists and environmental activists who call for swift and forceful action. It's military leaders in my own country and others who understand our common security hangs in the balance. Agreements among nations, strong institutions, support for human rights, investments in development. All these are vital ingredients in bringing about the evolution that President Kennedy spoke about. And yet, I do not believe that we will have the will, the determination, the staying power to complete this work without something more. And that's the continued expansion of our moral imagination. An insistence that there's something irreducible that we all share. As the world grows smaller, you might think it would be easier for human beings to recognize how similar we are, to understand that we're all basically seeking the same things, that we all hope for the chance to live out our lives with some measure of happiness and fulfillment for ourselves and our families. And yet somehow, given the dizzying pace of globalization, the cultural leveling of modernity, it perhaps comes as no surprise that people fear the loss of what they cherish in their particular identities, their race, their tribe, and perhaps most powerfully, their religion. In some places, this fear has led to conflict. At times, it even feels like we're moving backwards. We see it in the Middle East as the conflict between Arabs and Jews seems to harden. We see it in nations that are torn asunder by tribal lines. And most dangerously, we see it in the way that religion is used to justify the murder of innocents by those who have distorted and defiled the great religion of Islam and who attacked my country from Afghanistan. These extremists are not the first to kill in the name of God. The cruelties of the Crusades are amply recorded. But they remind us that no holy war can ever be a just war. For if you truly believe that you are carrying out divine will, then there is no need for restraint. No need to spare the pregnant mother, or the medic, or the Red Cross worker, or even a person of one's own faith. Such a warped view of religion is not just incompatible with the concept of peace, but I believe it's incompatible with the very purpose of faith. For the one rule that lies at the heart of every major religion is that we do unto others as we would have them do unto us. Adhering to this law of love has always been the core struggle of human nature. For we are fallible. We make mistakes and fall victim to the temptations of pride and power and sometimes evil. Even those of us with the
Temptation of pride. Yun ang nakaproblema sa atin, no? Pag pumasok na yung temptation of pride, okay, halimbawa ikaw ay opisyal na, okay, ikaw ay nakura na, okay, ikaw ang leader, and then pumasok ang temptation of pride, okay, hindi ka na makontrol mga suki, no? Yun ang danger po, okay, sa tao. Pag ang tao ay pinasok po ng temptation of pride mga suki, no? Yung sa, ano ba yung sa salita natin? Kibir. Sa mga sabi po ng mga, okay, kapatid natin po yung magdaawa, kibir. Pag pinasok ka ng kibir, mahirap na po ikokontrol ang tao, no? Kaya nga, kailangan pupuin po ang kibir mga suki, no? Tayo ay dapat magpupo ng kibir. Ayan. Mahirap na po. Pag ang pride na, magkaroon ka ng temptation of pride, hindi mo napapansinin ang kapwa mo. Akala mo ikaw na ang umbursato. Okay, ikaw na ang umbursato. Sabi ng iyakan mga suki, no? Ikaw na ang number one. Kasi pride na ang hinahawakan mo. Okay. So, yon po ang mga lecture makuha natin. Temptation of pride, mga suki, no? Okay. Tandaan nyo, temptation of pride. Ayan. Sige.
best of intentions will at times fail to right the wrongs before us. But we do not have to think that human nature is perfect for us to still believe that the human condition can be perfected. We do not have to live in an idealized world to still reach for those ideals that will make it a better place. The nonviolence practiced by men like Gandhi and King may not have been practical or possible in every circumstance, but the love that they preached, that fundamental faith in human progress, that must always be the North Star that guides us on our journey. For if we lose that faith, if we didn't...
Yun ang guidance po yung mga katulad nila Gandhi, katulad nila Martin Luther King, yung journey po ng non-violence, no? Okay, dapat po isa puso natin, isa isip natin, ilagay natin sa practice po. Okay? Iyang mga practice non-violence, okay? Journey of non-violence, no? Kaya sinabi ko ako ay kaya maglakad po ay hindi ako magdala ng mga bodyguard, mga suki, no? Hindi talaga. Kasi alam ko na wala akong kasalanan sa kapwa, mga suki, no? Hindi ako magdala ng okay, mga bodyguard, mga kung ano-ano diyan. Okay, kaya tatak bahala. Kung tapos na, wala na. Okay. Yan, journey of non-violence. Okay, dapat ipapractice natin mga kababayan, na. Okay. Hindi tayo ay puminsala lang kahit mga malit na bagay, pinsalain mo na. tapusin mo na, dedoin mo na, okay, ibig sabihin, patayin mo na yung kapwa mo. Okay, hindi pa sapat ang kasalanan niya mga suki sa iyo, no? So, journey of non-violence. Okay. Magandang lecture. Ayan, sige po.
Dismiss it as silly or naive. If we divorce it from the decisions that we make on issues of war and peace, then we lose what's best about humanity. We lose our sense of possibility. We lose our moral compass. Like generations have before us, we must reject that future. As Dr. King said at this occasion so many years ago, I refuse to accept despair as the final response to the ambiguities of history.
Ambiguity.
I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present condition makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. Let us reach for the world that ought to be, that spark of the divine that still steers within each of our souls. Somewhere today, in the here and now, in the world as it is, a soldier sees he's outgunned but stands firm to keep the peace. Somewhere today, in this world, a young protester awaits the brutality of her government, but has the courage to march on. Somewhere today, a mother facing punishing poverty still takes the time to teach her child, scrapes together what few coins she has to send that child to school, because she believes that a cruel world still has a place for that child's dreams. Let us live by their example. We can acknowledge that oppression will always be with us and still strive for justice. We can admit the intractability of deprivation and still strive for dignity. Clear-eyed, we can understand that there will be war and still strive for peace. We can do that, for that is the story of human progress. That's the hope of all the world. And at this moment of challenge, that must be our work here on earth. Thank you very much.
Okay, anak ng isang Muslim Kenyan, nag-aaral po sa Hawaii, University of Hawaii. And then nagkatagpo ng puting Amerikana. Yan po ang Barack Hussein Obama, mga suki, no? And then binigay ng talino. Okay, talagang nahubog po sa katalinuhan, mga suki, no? So yan. Combination po ng Kenyan, origin, Barack Hussein Senior, mga suki, no? Barack Hussein Senior, Obama, mga suki, no? And then ang nanay niya isang Durham. Okay, puti. Okay, nagkatagpo po diyan po sa Hawaii. Okay, swerte po ay naging presidente po ng 8 taon po sa Amerika, mga suki, no? Okay. Dahil po matalino. Ayan. So, wala na tayong oras. Tapusin na natin po, no? Okay. Para makagawa pa tayo ng maraming amal. Tahajjud, mga suki, no? Okay. Tahajjud tayo. Pagkatapos tayo makinig sa mga ganito, huwag po natin kalimutan po ang pagdasal natin ng hating gabi, no? Ayan. Wala ito masama. Hindi ito masama po para sa atin. Mga lecture ganito, makakabuti po sa pag-motivate, okay, pag-mold ng isang tao po, mga lecture ganito, no? Okay. Kaya, pinilit natin po, okay, pinaparinig mga mahalagang lecture ganito, mga suki, no? Ayan. Mga taga-makinig. Okay, kaya huwag niyo ko sabihan metal-metal, mga suki, no? Okay, huwag talaga. Okay, may bagong boss ang cooperative po ng Tumahubong, no? Co-op chairman ng Tumahubong Agrarian Reform Beneficiaries Development Cooperative, Tarbichi, may bagong chairman, no? Maxi Pa Arilon Max. Okay, Max, mga suki, no? Chairman Maxi is a son of our late Apo Sio Arilon of Barangay Manaon, Sumisip, Basilan. His father, Apo Sio, had been working with his Sime Darby for a couple number of years as security guard and community leader. Tarbich is a former multinational rubber plantation owned by Sime Darby Company of Malaysia, located in Barangay Tumahubong, Sumisip, Basilan Province. This agrarian reform cooperative has an area where 1,000 hectares planted with rubber tree, but some are senile and needed rehabilitation due to old age. Okay, so yan po ang bagong chairman po ng cooperative ng Tumahubong, no? Sige. Ayan. Okay. Please lang, huwag po sabihan nyo itong tagalingkod ng bayan, pamagitan ng microphone. Huwag nyo sabihan po ng metal-metal, mga suki, no? Please lang. Hindi po metal-metal ito, no? Okay. Ayan po. Huwag talaga sabihan nyo ng metal-metal itong, okay? Tagapagserbiso sa kahanginan, mga suki, no? Okay. Sige. Sana. Okay, makabusong po, banginarenan, metal-metal, no? Okay, please lang, huwag nyo okay, sabihan po ng metal-metal, no? Makabusong. Ayan. Sa lakas ng panawag niya sa Panginoon, okay, makabusong, mga suki, no? Ayan. Ayan. Awesome! Awesome! Ayan po, tapos ng programa natin. Okay, inulit-ulit natin, huwag sabihan po ng metal-metal, no? Ayan. Sige. Okay. Okay, paalam tayo dito po sa gabing ito. Okay ba? Umabot na po ng 25 minutos ang time check natin. Alas 11 po, no? Okay. So ako hindi rin ako matulog po mga kababayan. Pahinga lang ng konti mga ilang minutos. And then maraming din gawain, no? Hindi rin ako magtulog. Ayan. So, sige na po. Magpaalam tayo dito sa Consolidated News natin. Okay, sa programa po ng halo-halo special opinion balita at iba pa. Kasama po serbisyo publiko tinig ng mamamayan. And then ugnayan po ng mamamayan. Okay. Sa loob po ng si Katiling Kalalam po ang network natin, no? Ayan. Si Katiling Kalalam. Okay. So, okay, tapos na ang news natin. Okay, paalam tayo. Okay, tapos ng ugnayan natin sa network natin mga kababayan. Okay, paalam tayo. Wala tayong masamang tinapay po. Okay, mangaral lang. Okay, para sa kayusan natin lahat, no? Okay, so paano? Okay, this has been Abs-Namahan lamang po sa gabing ito. Okay, babalik din tayo. Okay, ika-4 na araw po ng pag-ayuno natin susunod na gabi, no? Hindi na ako magprograma po sa umaga. Hindi ko kaya. Kasi kunti lang mga tulog ko ngayon. And then pag-araw matulog tayo ng maigi. Ayan. Okay, so tapos na. Okay, mga suki-suki natin. Shout out. Shout out sa lahat po mga kababayan, na. Okay. Okay, kung ginawa kaya nila Risa Hontiveros, okay, ang mga batas ginawa nila, okay, para maayos po ang buhay natin, no? Okay, hindi puro, okay, puro mga ganito negatibo po mga suki, no? Okay, hindi po nakatulong yon. Okay, mas lalo lang okay, mahirap ang buhay natin mga suki. Tumulong para okay, yung ginagawa nila mga pag-public hearing yan. Okay, dapat po ay yung mga batas po nakakatulong po sa mamamayan, na. Kung napilyo na lang napilyo ang paghirap ng mamamayan, ewan ko na lang masuki, no? Yan lang sana ang gawin natin. Okay, contribution po para maayos ang buhay-buhay natin, na. Hindi yung purong okay, mga expose, mas lalo lang makasira sa atin, no? Ayan. So, ang kahilingan natin sa taghirap ngayon ay ganun sana, na? Okay? Paano karoon ng hanapbuhay po ang Pilipino, no? Okay. Paano mabuhay, magkaroon po ng mga livelihood ang Pilipino, no? Hindi ay puro expose yung mga suki, wala din contribution sa bayan, no? Ayan. Okay, tama na.
Female voice. Male lolly voice. Monster voice. Female voice. Male voice. Lolly voice. Monster voice.
Okay, 'di ba? Maayos mag-legislate sila para magkapera ang taong bayan, no? Ayan. Kasi mahirap ng buhay natin. Okay. Sa totoo lang. Totoo talaga. Sige.